A single soldier, wounded and alone, armed with nothing but a pistol and his sheer will to survive. His comrades are gone, the line is broken, and the enemy is closing in. This is not a story of a vast army, but of one man, a medic. His duty was to save lives, not take them. But on this day, in this frozen forest, he would be forced to do both. How could a wounded medic possibly hold off an entire SS patrol? And what happened next would defy all logic of war. The date was December 17th, 1944. The location, a sparse, snow-dusted stretch of woodland just outside the hamlet of Hunningen, Belgium. This was the northern shoulder of the German offensive, known as the Battle of the Bulge. The unit, elements of the 1st Battalion, 23rd Infantry Regiment of the American 2nd Infantry Division, the Indian Head. They had been hit hard by the initial onslaught, falling back in disarray under the weight of the 1st SS Panzer Division. And in that chaos, one man was left behind. To understand the desperation of this moment, we must first understand the storm that had broken over the Ardennes. Just 3 days prior, on December 16th, Hitler's last great gamble had erupted from the mist and snow. Over 200,000 German troops, supported by hundreds of panzers, slammed into thinly held American lines. Their objective, Antwerp, to split the Allied armies and force a negotiated peace. The 2nd Infantry Division was squarely in the path of the spearhead of the 6th Panzer Army, the fanatical and battle-hardened 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandard SS Adolf Hitler. For the weary GIs of the 23rd Infantry, the past 36 hours had been a nightmare of relentless pressure, confusion, and brutal combat. Orders were to hold at all costs, but the sheer weight of the German assault forced a fighting withdrawal. Among these men was Private First Class Richard Doc Anderson, a 22-year-old medic from Ohio attached to Baker Company. PA's medics in World War II were unique. They carried no rifle, only a satchel marked with red crosses, a canteen of water, and morphine syrettes. Their only weapon for personal defense was, by convention, a .45 caliber M1911 pistol. They were non-combatants, but on the battlefield, that distinction meant nothing. Doc Anderson had spent the last day and night moving under fire, dragging wounded men to relative safety, applying tourniquets, and offering words of reassurance he himself did not feel. By the morning of the 17th, Baker Company's position had become untenable. A coordinated German assault with Panzer Grenadiers supported by 2 Mk4 tanks overran their hastily dug foxholes. The order to fall back came too late for some. In the deafening roar of artillery and the staccato crack of machine gun fire, Anderson was bandaging a sergeant's leg wound when a German mortar round landed just 10 yards away. The sergeant was killed instantly. Shrapnel tore into Anderson's left thigh and shoulder. Dazed, bleeding, and partially deafened, he watched as the remnants of his company disappeared into the tree line to the west. He was alone. For a moment, there was an eerie quiet, broken only by the moans of the dying and the crackle of burning equipment. The bitter cold, which had sapped the men's strength for days, now became an active threat. Anderson knew his wounds required immediate attention. Blood was seeping through his trouser leg. But to move into the open was suicide. He could hear the guttural shouts of German voices moving through the positions to his left. He had minutes, perhaps seconds. Dragging himself and his medical bag, he half crawled, half stumbled into a small, recessed shell crater at the edge of the forest. It offered meager cover, but it was the only option. He fumbled with a sulfa packet and bandage, his fingers numb. His priority was the leg wound. A tourniquet was out of the question. The cold would finish what the shrapnel started. He packed the wound and bound it tight, the pain a white-hot fire. His shoulder was a deep, jagged gash, but it was not bleeding as profusely. Then he heard it, the crunch of boots on frozen snow. Not the disorganized looting of the initial wave, but a deliberate, methodical sweep. This was an SS patrol, likely a squad-strength element, tasked with clearing the area of stragglers and gathering intelligence. Their gray-green uniforms stood out against the snow. Anderson counted 5, then a 6th, moving in a loose skirmish line, weapons at the ready. They were less than 100 yards away and moving directly toward his position. Anderson's mind raced. His pistol, holstered at his side, held 7 rounds. 1 in the chamber, 6 in the magazine. Against 6 veteran SS troopers armed with MP-40 submachine guns and Kar-98K rifles, it was a laughable defense. He was a medic. His oath was to aid the wounded, not engage the enemy. But the wounded here were all Americans, and the enemy approaching would show no mercy. The rules of war had dissolved in the fog of this surprise offensive. By 1100 hours, the patrol was within 70 yards. They moved with professional caution, checking bodies, occasionally firing a round into a still form to ensure it was dead. Anderson pressed himself into the frozen earth of the crater, his heart hammering against his ribs. He could see their breath in the icy air. He made a decision. He would not be executed in his hole. If he was to die, he would at least force them to fight for it. He unsnapped his holster and drew the heavy M1911. The lead German, an NCO with an MP-40 slung across his chest, stopped. He was looking directly at the crater. He had seen something, a disturbed snowdrift, a trace of blood. He barked an order, and 2 troopers broke from the line, advancing with their rifles leveled. They were 50 yards, then 40. Anderson's hands trembled, not from fear alone, but from shock and blood loss. He steadied the pistol against the lip of the crater, lining up the crude sights on the closest soldier. The shot, when it came, was thunderous in the silent wood. The German soldier cried out, clutching his chest and collapsing into the snow. The other trooper dove for cover, screaming a warning. The patrol instantly scattered, taking up positions behind trees and a fallen log. They had not expected resistance. For a few precious minutes, there was only the sound of the wounded man's whimpers. Then the storm broke. A hail of automatic fire ripped into the crater's edge, kicking up dirt and snow. Anderson ducked down, his ears ringing. He was trapped. He couldn't run. He could only wait for the inevitable assault, or for them to flank him. He fired 2 more blind shots in the direction of the muzzle flashes, not to hit anyone, but to tell them he was still there, still fighting. The exchange settled into a tense stalemate. The SS squad, now aware they faced a determined defender in a good position, were hesitant to rush. Anderson knew this. He checked his pistol. 4 rounds left. He had 1 spare magazine in his belt. 11 rounds total against a squad that seemed content to wait him out. The cold was seeping deeper into his bones. The pain in his leg was a constant, throbbing agony. He felt consciousness beginning to waver. He tied a length of bandage around his forehead, biting down on the cloth to stifle a scream as he tightened it, a brutal attempt to stay alert. By 1400 hours, the Germans had maneuvered. He could hear movement to his right. They were trying to get around him. He fired his second-to-last round from his first magazine toward the sound, and the movement stopped. But he was now effectively surrounded. The patrol leader shouted something in German. It wasn't an offer of surrender. It was an order to prepare for the final rush. This was the moment of utter hopelessness. PFC Richard Anderson, medic, was out of options. His medical bag, with its symbols of mercy, lay covered in grime next to him. His weapon was nearly empty. His body was failing. The enemy was closing the noose. He could see shadows moving between the pines, getting closer with each passing second. The Germans had identified his position precisely and were coordinating their final assault. 2 would provide covering fire, while the others charged. Anderson loaded his last magazine, chambering a round. 7 shots stood between him and oblivion. He thought of home, of the men he had failed to save, of the absurdity of it all. He was not an infantryman. He was a healer. And yet, here he was, preparing to make his last stand in a freezing hole in Belgium. The covering fire began again, more intense now. Bullets snapped overhead and thudded into the frozen ground. He could hear the guttural yells of the SS troopers psyching themselves up for the charge. This was it. He raised his pistol, his vision swimming. He would take 1 more with him. That was all he could hope for. Then, a new sound cut through the din of gunfire. A deep, grinding roar from the west. The sound of tank tracks churning snow and earth. Anderson's heart sank further. German armor. It was over. The patrol heard it too, and their fire slackened for a moment, perhaps in confusion. The sound grew louder, closer. It was not the high-pitched whine of a German engine. It was the throaty, powerful growl of an American radial engine. Through a gap in the trees, a shape emerged. Not the angular profile of a German Mk4 or Panther, but the familiar, robust silhouette of an M4 Sherman tank. And behind it, a line of infantry in winter parkas, moving with purpose.
It was a counterattack.
Elements of the 2nd Infantry Division's 38th Infantry Regiment, supported by tanks from the 741st Tank Battalion, had been ordered to blunt the German advance and reclaim lost ground. For the SS Patrol, the calculus of the battle had just changed catastrophically. They were now the ones in danger of being cut off and destroyed. The patrol leader shouted a frantic order. The shadows in the woods retreated, dragging their wounded comrade with them. They melted back into the forest to the east, disappearing as quickly as they had come. Sherman advancing with infantry, Anderson lay in his crater, unable to process the sudden silence. The roar of the Sherman was directly above him now. He heard American voices. Cautious, battle-hardened. A GI peered over the edge of the crater, his M1 Garand pointed downward. He saw the blood, the medical bag, the pistol in Anderson's limp hand. Medic. We got a live one here. It's one of ours. What happened next was a confluence of sheer luck, tactical timing, and the unyielding spirit of the American soldier. The counterattack force, led by Lieutenant James Corrigan, had been advancing along a pre-planned route to reinforce the collapsing line. Their orders were to establish a blocking position. They had no intelligence about a lone medic holding a position. They were simply in the right place at the absolute last possible moment. Anderson was pulled from the crater. The battalion medic for the 38th Infantry, a man named PFC Harold Jensen, immediately went to work. He saw Anderson's crude bandages, the signs of shock and hypothermia. Jensen administered morphine, cleaned the wounds properly, and applied fresh dressings. He likely saved Anderson from losing his leg to gangrene. But the miracle was not just his rescue. As Lieutenant Corrigan debriefed a semi-conscious Anderson, the medic described the patrol, their strength, their direction, their apparent mission. This was vital tactical information. Corrigan realized the woods ahead might still be infested with small, probing enemy elements. He adjusted his platoon's advance, ordering his men to move with heightened caution and deploying his Sherman tank to shell suspected assembly areas. More importantly, Anderson's desperate, one-man delaying action had, without his knowledge, achieved a minor but critical military objective. The SS patrol he had engaged was a reconnaissance element for a larger company-sized force preparing to outflank the next American position a half-mile to the west. The patrol's 90-minute engagement with Anderson and their subsequent retreat from the American counterattack meant they failed to report that the road was, for a brief window, undefended. This delayed the German company's maneuver by over 2 hours. In that time, the 38th Infantry Regiment solidified its new blocking position. When the German company finally did advance, they ran headlong into a prepared defense with tank support. Their attack was repulsed with heavy losses. A small, localized German opportunity had been lost, in part because a wounded medic with a pistol had refused to die quietly. Anderson's actions, born of pure survival instinct, had inadvertently disrupted the enemy's reconnaissance and timing. He had held his ground not for a flag or a grand strategy, but for his own life. Yet in doing so, he bought precious minutes for his brothers in arms. Richard Anderson was evacuated to a field hospital and later to England. He survived his wounds, though he would carry shrapnel in his leg for the rest of his life. The war for him was over. He returned to Ohio in the summer of 1945 to a quiet life. He rarely spoke of that day in the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge raged on for another month, ultimately ending in a decisive Allied victory that broke the back of the German war machine. The 2nd Infantry Division continued to fight with distinction from the Bulge to the heart of Germany. It was not until 1947, during a routine review of after-action reports and recommendations for Valor Awards, that Anderson's story resurfaced. Statements from Lieutenant Corrigan and members of his platoon, who had witnessed the aftermath and the retreating enemy patrol, corroborated the extraordinary circumstances. The Army determined that PFC Richard Anderson, Medical Detachment, 23rd Infantry Regiment, 2nd Infantry Division, had displayed conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. On November 10, 1948, in a ceremony at the White House, President Harry S. Truman placed the blue ribbon of the Medal of Honor around Richard Anderson's neck. The citation specifically credited his dogged determination to live and fight on while wounded, which disrupted an enemy reconnaissance in force, delayed a coordinated enemy attack, and enabled friendly forces to reorganize and counterattack. His was one of only a handful of Medals of Honor awarded to medics during the Second World War. He was a healer who, in one desperate moment, became a warrior, and in doing so, saved untold lives beyond that frozen shell hole. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. A story not of generals and grand strategy, but of individual courage, chance, and the incredible resilience of the human spirit in the face of annihilation. Subscribe to Untold War Stories as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.